Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Jeannine Field, current Executive Director of Kenosha Human Development Services, and Byron Wright, former Executive Director of the group. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
It's good to be here.
Thank you.
So, what is Kenosha Human Development Services in a general sense, without going through the whole history of it?
Sure. Kenosha Human Development Services is a private, nonprofit social service organization that provides a number of both contracted services for the county and then a number of state and local federal grants to work with homelessness, to work with mental health, to work with children in need. We provide a wide gamut of social services and human service programs to the community.
Okay, so when was it founded, organized, and who were the leading forces behind that organization?
KHDS started in 1974. It started as a group of citizens who really realized that there were no placements for children who were in need of care, and so they started an organization called Kenosha Area Group Homes. The name of the person
Some
just
of the
blanked
people
me.
involved?
It was called, the original place was called Munger House, who was a Catholic priest here in Kenosha. But among the founders were Connie Forwerda,
Thank you. That was the name I was looking for.
Joan Wilk,
Yes.
who both people were very involved in starting multiple services in Kenosha, particularly Connie Forwerda.
Yes.
She was probably on the founding board of 5 or 6 different agencies. And then the other thing that I think is pretty critical is among the early staff that was hired there and had a huge influence on the agency and the way it grew was a guy named Dick Kaufman. He was there from the beginning, started out as a teaching parent with his wife in a group home for girls. And then we had a young psychologist whose name was Rich Bednar. And he was also very influential in the way the organization grew.
Okay, so you mentioned that it was founded in 1974. Prior to that, was there any county department, any county system for help?
Certainly. The Kenosha County certainly was the organization that was taking care of children in need at the time. And I wasn't here at the time, but my guess would be they would have had a series of foster homes that they placed children in. But I just know they were having difficulty, as we do now, continuing to recruit foster parents. But there were no organizations as a whole that were really providing children on that level in residential type
The county
care.
itself was not providing that either?
Not group care, not the residential care, but likely some sort of fostering or kinship, like family care, things like that.
So the driving force of the organization was for at-risk children?
Children who needed to be removed from their homes for one reason or another, either because they were getting themselves into trouble and couldn't be at home anymore, or because of abuse and neglect, and they just couldn't stay at home and be safe.
Okay. So what were the first programs that Kenosha Human Development Services created?
Crisis intervention was actually the very first program, and that provided a 24-hour number for families to call if they were in need of any sort of intervention services. So a family in need of having a difficult time with a teenager, having a difficult time caring for their young child. KHDS, at that time, Kenosha Area Group Homes, provided that. And while we started that, we started working toward all of the residential programs. And so that was the first thing you could start, because you could do that without a license and without property. And so they started that business, started working on crisis intervention. and then through the next year started purchasing and renting properties to start the boys group home, the girls group home, and the shelter care facility.
Okay, so when you say this was designed in part for parents,
Yes.
because they could no longer handle the child's behavior. And also, it was to get the child removed from an abusive situation at home.
There were all sorts of reasons that kids came to us, certainly. Some of those were because of delinquencies, and some of those were because of safety, absolutely.
And today, how many programs are there?
Right now, we run 39 programs. So, and we're no longer really in the residential business and long term. We still run a shelter that's been running since 1976, I believe.
Yeah.
And we now run an adult residential facility for folks doing mental health stabilization called the Care Center. And those are the two residential programs we still have, but everything else has kind of stemmed from that very beginning. We still run a crisis unit focused purely on mental health and mental health emergencies. And then we also do child abuse and neglect investigations after hours and on weekends for the County Department of Children and Family Services.
Okay, and how many employees?
We
are
right now
involved?
have 175.
Okay.
When I started there in 1989, we had 70. And when Byron started,
8229. So,
Okay,
we've had as many as 220 at a time. And we've, like you said, I went back to the first annual report and we started with 20.
okay. And Byron, when did you start working there, and what were the things that you were involved in?
well, the first thing I did when I went to work there is I worked at Phoenix House, which was the boys' group home. And we took up to 8 boys. All of them pretty much were delinquent.
Okay.
A lot of them were coming out of corrections. And we had them for about 6 months, and the goal was to get them home and reintegrate them into the community.
Okay, now, this was boys of all ages, a certain narrow group of ages?
12 through 17, with an occasional 18-year-old. Sometimes kids were extended on juvenile supervision beyond their 18th birthday. But the majority of them were 16, 17-year-olds.
Right. And you only had 6 months to kind of get them back and reestablished?
Some of them stayed a little longer, but that was kind of your average length of stay. And the kids, a lot of times, we had a significant number of kids who would come to us who'd run away. A lot of the kids that we got still had a lot of issues, and you had to work very hard to help them control their behavior so they would stay in the community.
So, because there could be so many different reasons for their behavior, did you have other help than just, we're at a group home for 6 months? I mean, was it just the people in the group home trying to do it, or were there other people who came in to work with them during that time?
We had some people who came in and did some services with some of the kids. Sometimes you would try to get them hooked up with some sort of therapy. But in general, when you were living in the group home, we were pretty much responsible for developing and putting into place a plan of care for kids.
So when you say a group home and you being in a group home, how long were you in the group home? I mean, the kids came for 6 months. You did what? You lived there, you commuted from home to work?
We worked, when I went to work there, we worked 96 hours on and 48 hours off. So you came to work for 4 days and you slept there.
So it's kind of like a fire department when they staff and you're
Kinda
on
like.
until your time is
Yes.
off.
And so by virtue of that sort of schedule, it wasn't a job that people stayed there for a long time. It was essentially kind of entry level. For example, I did it for 2 years, and that's kind of the max that people did it, was about 2 years.
Okay. Then what other jobs did you do during the course of your employment there?
Well, we had an independent living program that I helped start,
Okay.
which was putting 17-year-olds out on their own in the community, both delinquent and non-delinquent youth, and a variety of living arrangements. And those kids were all in the system. And so we just worked with them to try to teach them the skills they were going to need once they became adults, which was rapidly approaching. We had a 12-bed halfway house, ended up 14 beds for the Department of Corrections for guys coming out of prison. We had a significant number of scattered site living arrangements for 18 to 21-year-olds who were homeless. We also had some scattered site living arrangements for people in the Department of Corrections. And so that was the population. I worked with a lot of people who were in transition.
Okay. Now, when you say scattered living arrangements, I mean, obviously there's some in the shelter that you said you had. What other scattered living arrangements did these 17, 18-year-olds live under, and how do they take care of themselves?
Well, they had an opportunity through us to earn some money for their daily expenses. The other thing is we started a lot of kids at the KYF. At the time, the KYF had over 120 sleeping rooms. And so we would put kids at the KYF, and a lot of them stayed there. We also had a network of landlords who would work with us. And kind of help keep track of the kids and make sure they got at least one good meal a day. We put them on vouchers and they ate at Frank's Diner.
Okay.
Downtown.
Was there any accountability for those young adults that they were scattered around and given vouchers? I mean, was there any accountability at all?
One of the things that we brought to the agency fairly early, and that goes back to Dick Kaufman, is the teaching family model, which is a model of care that helps adults figure out what are the skill development that the kids need in order to be successful. And within that model, we use what we call a motivation system. Just like you come to work and you get paid, in the independent living program at some point we developed what we call a timesheet. And every week when they came in to talk to their worker, they would, what do you need to do this week to earn your money? What on your timesheet do you need to accomplish? And so for most kids, it was you need to go to school, you need to be looking for work or working, or you needed to be in therapy and you need to see your therapist and I need proof that you did that. Not what you talked about, but at least that you made it. Or other treatment things that were going on for the young person. And so we would, at the time, we had a 3-carbon piece of paper that they would take a copy, we would have a copy, and the copy would go in the file. And then the next week we would check off and decide how much the check would be that they were able to earn given what they had done the week before.
So there was a minimum, maximum, and
Yes.
depending on...
Correct. We always paid their rent,
abilities.
so we never had to worry about them being homeless unless they were doing things that got them kicked out of things, which did happen from time to time. But they had accountability in they could earn their living by following up and doing the things that we asked them to do for the week.
And they met with somebody.
Yes, we were meeting with them more regularly than once a week, but once a week we sat down and did their timesheet with them.
Okay. And how long were you with the organization, Byron?
35 years.
Okay, so you were in the group home, you were working with these transitional scattered living arrangement children. What are things that you do in the course of your work there?
You mean just day
What
to
did
day?
you do? Yeah.
Well-
other things. You said there are how many, 39 programs?
39 today right now, yes.
A lot of times, one of the things that I did there was I did a lot of individual casework with children when we did independent living and the scattered sites and all of that. And then at some point, as I moved up, what I did was supervised other people who were working directly with the kids. And the other thing I did a lot of when I was there was, we were always looking for other programs we could develop. And so I spent a significant amount of my time kind of looking around to see if there were other programs we could develop and looking for funds and trying to expand the services that were available to children and young adults in Kenosha.
Byron was very much the builder of the organization.
Okay.
Through his time there, he spent a lot of time building up systems that we now are able to build upon. But Byron was really the person who made us who we are as a large organization.
So as you said, you started with this small number of programs, expanded to 39.
Correct.
Mentioned that you're out of residential care for youth pretty much. So what other programs did you develop for what population?
Well, we developed, at one point, we had about 25 corrections clients that we were housing between Columbus House and some scattered sites that we ran for the Department of Corrections. The other thing we got heavily involved in starting in the 90s and has continued is providing services for young adults who are homeless. And we started out getting money through the Federal Youth Services Bureau, and then a lot of those programs switched to Housing and Urban Development was the funding source. And so essentially, we probably have about 50,
Almost 80.
scattered sites for people who are homeless, who are adults, for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
Mental health issues. Some of them are just young people who kind of aged out of the system and ended up being homeless, but they have a variety of issues that make it hard for them to maintain housing.
What kind of a budget does the organization have?
Right now, total, we're at about 14 million total.
And where does this money come from?
About 9 million of that comes from Kenosha County and contracts that we do services for them. Almost 2.5 million comes from Housing and Urban Development and either pass-through money through them or our local coalition for homelessness. And then we have a variety of state and local grants to run. We just finished up a grant for the Veterans Administration where we were working with veterans who just were not able to receive care through the VA, or something was keeping them from accessing care from the VA. And so we would figure out what they needed, do some case management, and then help them recommit to getting into treatment back into the VA. And so we're always looking for pockets of things to do, trying to find dollars to do programs. We often will do what we call a gap analysis in the community to figure out what the needs are. And then if there's money available, we'll figure out how to do those programs.
And you mentioned working with homelessness.
Yes.
And finding pockets of money. How did you manage to find these pockets of money that would allow you to initiate or launch a program?
Well, we were always members of the Wisconsin Association of Runaway Services. And at some point, through their funder, the Federal Youth Services Bureau, out of the blue, they kind of released some grant money to provide transitional housing for 16 to 21-year-olds who were homeless. And we wrote and got that money. And I remember well writing it the first time because I didn't know much about it, but I had worked with independent living kids in the system a lot. And so I wrote it, and I think they funded 38 programs across the country, and I found out we scored 39th. But what I knew is there was another round of 42 coming up the next year, so felt pretty confident we could get that money. And so since we already had a network of housing developed because of independent living, and then the other thing that happened, we needed a place to run it out of, and the old Weybridge halfway house for drug and alcohol had lost their funding, so that building was available through the Episcopal Church, and they rented that to us as a place to run about a 4-bed group home and then manage another 15 scattered sites for homeless youth. So that was the start of homeless youth, and that was on a 3-year grant cycle.
And have you continued to get that money?
We don't anymore.
Okay.
But we have been able to use other monies to continue to do that. So instead of the Federal Youth Services Bureau, which does still hold those grants, but they're really trying to get new providers into that system. So at some point we were no longer in that system, but now what we do is a youth project that through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and it's called YHDP, and I cannot recall what that stands for. But it's meant to work with kids aging out of the system and kids who find themselves homeless from 18 to 24. So we're still providing that level of service, 9 units of transitional housing And then we have a system navigator who, when we find ourselves running into kids who are at risk of homelessness or actually literally homeless, we have a person who helps them figure out where they can go next. What are the resources in their lives that we really need to re-enhance and reconnect them with? So we're still able to provide the service, but in a different way and under different funding.
How many other grants did you write to get money for programs that you had ideas for?
Oh, lots of different things. The big one were the homeless programs and the Department of Corrections programs. And then, of course, you had to write RFPs for county funds to run like independent living and those sort of programs. The other thing that you're always faced with in a social service agency is nobody wants to pay for you to put on a roof.
Yeah.
And so we were always on the lookout for little bits of money to do capital improvements. The Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority had a grant system that you could get up to about $25,000 to do that sort of thing. And it was very easy to write. And what I realized is if I wrote it every year, I'd get it 1 out of every 3. But you never knew quite when, so it was always worth writing. Community Development Block Grant through the city of Kenosha. They had money for capital improvements for the types of programs that we ran, to like put a roof on the juvenile shelter or roof the group home. And so we always were involved in community development block grants. We got money from the Lions Club. And I forget, it was the Lions or somebody funded paid for the original juvenile shelter. It was $25,000.
Yeah. That was not the Lions Club.
No, it wasn't.
Kiwanis. The Kiwanis gave us the shelter at
6012 8th
6012 8th Avenue. And then at some point we took on the what is now our Kaufman House, named after Dick Kaufman, at 5510 22nd Avenue. 22nd Avenue. And that was the original church rectory for Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel.
And when Mount Carmel moved on the other side of 22nd Avenue, that house remained, still had the gymnasium attached. And we were able to remodel that sometime in the early 80s to make that into a child's group home called Phoenix House.
Okay, was there ever any problem with finding shelter for these homeless kids? Was there a state law that at some point said, you can't just let them run around, that the counties have to provide care or something?
It is the loosest written legislation you will ever read. It says that you can put children out on their own in a supervised independent living arrangement with no definition of what supervision is.
But who had to pay for it?
Oh, the county.
The county had to do this.
And of course part of the county's reason for doing this, other than just wanting to provide care, is a day on independent living was about $30 a day was the county's cost. And even back then, a day in a group home was over $100. So it was cost effective to put kids out on their own. And also the other thing is the reality of it is within 6 months they were going to be on their own anyway. So let's get them out there and give them some practice when there's still a safety net. And the other thing about putting someone out on their own is there are natural consequences when you do dumb things. And if you're out there, a lot of times the consequences come hard and fast when you're out on your own. And so yes, they have this to fall back on, but there were a lot of teaching opportunities.
And about 6 years ago or so, in part again because Byron put out the breadcrumbs, the state put out requests for proposals for regional aftercare for children who are aging out of the human services systems. And so we are now the regional provider to work with the kids on independent living who, once they're out of county care, now they're in this state-funded program that we're allowed to follow them for up till they're turn 21. Which that's a really nice service, because there was a long period of time that when you turned 18, the day you turned 18, you were cut out of the system. And what Byron and I learned a long time ago was, most young people in the United States are not prepared to be on their own until they're about 26.
Yep.
That's when parents really stop paying all their bills. You're paying your own car insurance and your own phone at 26. So when you're 18 and you haven't had parents for a while, and we've been your parents for a while, and all of a sudden you're done, no health insurance, no anything, having this program now, and that is now run by Denise Durdine, who has also been with the agency going on 42 years, I believe. She wrote that, and she is making sure that those kids who are aging out of not just independent living, but also foster care in Kenosha, Racine, and Walworth counties, that we support those kids right up until they're 21 now.
Do you have any sense of these children that have consequences if they aren't doing the right kind of things? Is there any sense of how many of these kids have moved on in a successful way of their own to, I know what I'm doing now, I can take care of myself, I've learned?
Well, since we run the adult system in a lot of ways for the mental health system, what we have is a lot of data that because we work with kids when they were just a part of a large family and we were involved in that family, and because we've been around for 50 years and we have databases, Byron at some point did a study and was able to show that very few children that we touch in the children's crisis or children's system go on to become
Adult criminals.
2%, I think, was what it was about.
Basically, having a record of criminal activity as a kid didn't carry over much to adult. I mean, there were some, certainly. I think what's interesting is when you look at the kids, and the luxury is, I mean, I've lived in the center of Kenosha this whole time, and a lot of people know where I live, and so people stop by. What's fascinating is a lot of them have a lot of struggles, and they don't really get it together until their late 20s. What I find very hopeful with many of the ones I know is how well their children are doing.
And grandchildren.
And grandchildren. So, they use the base that we gave them to move forward. And it was a very informal thing. I mean, we always encouraged our former kids who we worked with, they could always call us.
Yep. Once a client, always a client.
Yep. You're ours. And the nice thing that we were able to do because of that, because we already had relationships, we could cut through a lot of stuff. And because they still a lot of times had they had behaviors that were hard to deal with, and a lot of times they weren't very trusting and they weren't very nice to new people in their lives. So it was good that we were around to help intervene and help them get things that they need sometimes.
And a part of the model that I talked about earlier, the teaching family model, one of the tenets of that is unconditional positive regard, regardless of the decisions that they make. And so every day is a new day. You could really have had a problem with me yesterday, and in many situations I'm done with you. That's not how we operate. Tomorrow's a new day. So why don't you go home, figure out what you need from me, and come back, and we'll see what we can do again tomorrow. And so having that philosophical approach pretty much across the board in all of our programs, it creates the relationship with our consumers, although very appropriate, is also much greater than it is in many social service agencies, because once a client, you're going to be our client for a very long time. Yesterday, I got a phone call from a young woman that I worked with in shelter care back in the early 90s. She was on homeless youth. She had a child when she was on homeless youth. She worked in some of our other homelessness programs, and she's married to a gentleman that she was living with in one of our group homes back in the 90s. Still married, has children, has grandchildren, and just needed help figuring out how to access some additional services for her grandchildren. And I took that call, of course, and we talked it through, and she's like, okay, I know how to do this. It's like, yep. But that was 30 years ago when she and I met, and she and I started to get to know one another. And I still get those calls pretty regularly. I also get a lot of I didn't understand what you were trying to tell me back then, Jeannine. I get it now. I'm really sorry. And here we are. And so having the longevity that Byron and I and many other folks in the agency have had really does lend itself to that we're always going to be here. You know, we're just going to, you can generally always pick up the phone and either call us, know who we are. Byron, if you picked up a phone book and you could find one, his number's still in it. He hasn't changed his number in the 35 years he's been in Kenosha. And so we're still very accessible to anybody who we've served over the last 35 years.
And how long have you been involved with the organization?
I as well have been there now 35 years, have no intention of going anywhere anytime soon. But this was my first job out of college at 22 and never assumed I would still be there 35 years later.
Is this true of a lot of the people who work for the group?
It is. As generations happen, it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be. But the people who work in senior leadership and middle management now are people generally who have been there well over 20 years. And our average length of stay, given the fact that we do so much entry-level work, our average length of stay for an employee is about 5.5 years, which for a human service organization is pretty good, considering we do a lot of entry-level where you're not going to stay there more than 2 years, and you're going to move up into your career path. But we do have a number of folks like myself, Denise Dean, like I said, Lisa Hain, who is our associate director, who have been here well over the 20-year mark, and we're almost over the 30-year mark at this point.
Now, you mentioned earlier about mental health issues were some of the problems that the youth had.
Yep.
Did you develop a specific program to deal with mental health issues for youth?
For youth themselves, we generally use our philosophical approach called the teaching family model. So we have a basic set of assumptions or operational theories when we work with anybody, including our employees. One, everybody has skills when they come to us, but everybody needs more skills. And so our job is to really figure out what are the things you're going to need to know for you to be successful. Now, there's a big, thick book of social skills that we work with, but when you're in the work long enough, you just kind of figure out, okay, I think what you need is to learn how to disagree appropriately. So we're going to work on that. We also assume that everybody's in a very different developmental stage, that some kids weren't able to work through some of those really basic developmental processes that you work through when you have an intact family. And so sometimes when they come to us, we're still working through that. And that's trust, and that's being able to do things independently, that's being able to have initiative to take things on your own. We understand that the family, your family, is always going to be much more powerful and influential in your life than we will ever be. Even if you don't want it to be, it still will be. And so we use that as a basis of what we do. And then lastly, everybody needs a sense of belonging. And so we work very hard to help kids and our adults understand that you got to get connected to folks. You got to get connected to systems. You got to find something that you feel good about, that you can belong to, that's bigger than you. So if that's your church, if that's your social group, if that's your friends, there has to be something besides yourself and your family that you're going to be able to put your energy into. And with those four things, you can put system after system after system together to help folks understand this is how I need to grow, to be more productive, and to be, a part of the community in a better way.
Was there a program, I think it was called Kenosha Youth Development Services? What was that?
That was the name of the agency.
Oh, that was the agency.
That was the name of the agency.
And who was in charge of that?
Well, I'm trying to think. It's basically always been the same agency.
Yes.
And there have been four directors of the agency.
Yeah.
When I was, right before I became director, it went from Kenosha Youth Development Services to KHDS, Kenosha Human Development Services, because our funders at the county, we were doing a lot of work with adults and they didn't want it to be called kids. So we changed the Y to an H, which confused the world, because then for many years everybody thought we were the county.
Yes, and still do, for that
Still
matter.
do. So, and that's how our name changed from Kenosha Youth Development Services to Kenosha Human Development Services.
And that happened in 1994. Okay. So we started as Kenosha Area Group Homes. That was a pretty clunky name. And so right around 1980, they changed to Kenosha Youth Development Services. Kept that until about 94, and then in 94 we became Kenosha Human Development Services.
Tell me about George Schwartz.
George Schwartz. George became our director in 1980. He was the second director. He had been working in Kenosha County for quite some time in the.
We worked for the county.
Yeah.
In human services, and George was the person who put the system in place for AFDC, for welfare. And he developed the forms and set up that whole system for Kenosha County. George, a very systemic thinker.
Yes, but that was back in the 70s.
But that was back in the 70s. And then in 1980, he was kind of in between jobs, and
he had moved to Michigan for a while and was actually running some systems kind of as a consultant to put computer systems together. He started as a Chrysler worker, or whatever it was called back then, and he decided he got a degree in geography and decided to just go into human services. But he started on the product line like a lot of people did in Kenosha, and he ended up getting into human services, as Byron said, developed a lot of programs, a lot of systems, moved to Michigan, and then came home. And when he was back in Kenosha in 1980, he became the second director of Kenosha, at that time, Kenosha Youth Development Services.
Okay. I know we touched earlier about less residential care and youth. You've grown into other areas for older populations. Can you tell me about what those have been and how many programs deal with adults?
In 1982, there's a board in every county that manages the adult mental health system. I believe it's called the 51 board.
The 51 board.
And they are tasked as a subset of the county to develop a program or a set of programs that can help manage folks with severe and persistent mental illness and folks who are just having a difficult time in life. And that was housed at the old St. Catherine's Hospital, where there was also a psychiatric facility there as well. So they had a number of beds and a unit inside that psychiatric facility that through the 51 board provided all of that system programming. I think there was a conflict of interest, and so the 51 board said, we need that to get out of the psychiatric facility and out into the community. And that's when George made a pitch for it to come over to KYDS at the time. And so we had a couple of nurses come over and a couple of case managers. I think there was only 4 who came over at the time.
And Rich Bednar.
Rich Bednar. But Linda Pavalko, Carol Cairo, Christopherson, I believe at the time, and a number of other folks who came over from St. Catherine's developed what became really the Community Intervention Center, ran by the Department of Aging and Disability Services. And that really grew into where we are right now, which is a vast majority of what we do is adult services.
Which was essentially a managed care system for mental health, with a crisis component, a residential component, an ongoing case management component. And also a system where, one of the things that we did was, because we were adult and juvenile crisis, every crisis contact every 24 hours was dictated, and it was printed up, and there were people every morning on both the adult and the juvenile side who went over all the contacts from the day before.
And we still do that to this day.
Yeah.
Generally, that's about 60 contacts a day that we read out loud every morning. 8:15 we have the adult or the crisis now, and at 11 o'clock we do any child abuse and neglect claims.
Okay, so, but you go beyond just mental health programs for adults. Is that true? You deal with homelessness in adults?
Absolutely. I think it kind of all melds together. Because our specialty in homelessness is those with the highest level of need, and oftentimes that's that's with folks who have significant mental health, alcohol and drug abuse, or other disabilities that really prevent them from being stably housed.
But you have 39 programs.
Yes, we
Some
do.
of those programs have to be specific to this adult, that adult, and another adult. Is that true?
It is on some level, and yet they cross over quite a bit. So we run a case management program for folks with severe and persistent mental illness called Community Support Program. About 100 people in our community who, without us, would probably be institutionalized or living in group care, whereas because they're case managed by us, they're able to stay in the community. We were fortunate enough to have a pharmacy come and rent part of our building so that we have our own private pharmacist to work with these folks with their psychiatric medications. Within that program, we also have Bridges Community Center, which is a drop-in center downtown that serves right around 100 people a month, individuals a month who drop in and do groups. They do 13 groups a week, where they are dealing with support group for bipolar disorder, or they're working on just an academic. They do have a book club. They talk about if you're somebody who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, they have support groups for all sorts of things that just help people feel connected and develop a level of community. When I think about, we do manage anyone who is involuntarily hospitalized for a period of time. We manage their court orders. Or if they become hospitalized and they really don't need long-term management, we do what's called a settlement agreement, where they make a promise that they'll be okay, but then we pay attention to what's going on, that they are able to fulfill their requirements. We're the payee of about 600 people. So when somebody has Social Security disability insurance and is paid a monthly income from Social Security, but they're not really able to manage their own money, we are named their payee, and so we take in their dollars. We make sure their rent's paid. We make sure that their electricity stays on. We make sure that all the things that they need to have a safe life is taken care of, and then they get the rest of that money. Oftentimes that's not enough, and so we're constantly trying to figure out how to help them with other resources in the community or with other family members to touch in with, to ensure that they're getting all their needs met. But that payee program is something that 600 individuals were making sure all their rent's paid every month. So
You talked about some people who, without one of your programs, would be institutionalized. People in the community have a tendency to maybe fear people in the community when you say, well, they would be institutionalized, but they're not.
correct.
And the person in the community says, well, how does that make me feel? Do you ever have to deal with that?
Oh, absolutely. And the reality is, these are the folks who are much more the victims of crime than on any level a perpetrator of crime. Yeah. I feel much safer with most of the folks I work with than I do in the community as a whole. These are folks who take their medication. They come and see us all the time. We're in their homes pretty consistently to make sure that things are going okay. And because we have that relationship with them, and we, at the very beginning of our contacts, and again, because we do so many things, we often know them from a very young age, to where we're with them at that initial break. We have a number of young people who we worked with in independent living and shelter care, in homeless youth, who are now in our community support program because we were with them in that initial time period. And so because we know them so well, we can see what's happening. We develop what they call a RAP plan, an individual progress plan. So we ask them when things are going really well. When we see things not going well, how do you want us to do that? How do you want us to bring that to you? And so they'll give us permission to say, yeah, when things aren't really going well, call my mom. Now, what I know is when things aren't going well, the last thing they're going to want us to do is to call their mom. But because they gave us permission when things were well, and we're able to, because they signed on the line that we could, we're able to intervene with them with their important support systems to get them back to where they need to be okay again. And so we're able to develop plans with people to keep them safe, and on that level then keep the community safe.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the other programs. You mentioned there's homelessness, there's the at-risk youth and those support programs.
Yeah.
Do you do any of the any specific programs for veterans? Do you have any specific programs for children with other situations than at-risk type of thing? What other things are you involved in?
We work with veterans pretty consistently in our crisis intervention because they just call. It's a 24-hour-a-day phone call, and we will always answer the phone. A live person has answered our phone since we opened that program in 1974. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So of course we always are working with pretty every much population there is. This last year we did have a veterans program. We were able to secure about $100,000 to provide case management program. We have now spent that money and we're looking for the next round to get back involved in that. But one of our largest programs today is a program that works with children with autism and other developmental disabilities who have needs that we become the purchase of service for them. So we go into parents' homes, we do an assessment, we figure out what a child, what their needs are in the moment. So some of our kids are not communicators. They're not able to communicate with their parents. And so we will figure out, is this an issue where if they go to occupational therapy or speech therapy, that might be something we can help them with. And so we will find a provider to provide that service for them. Or we may be able to provide devices for them. I mean, technology is such a lovely thing these days. Most autistic kids who are non-communicative want to be able to communicate with you, they just don't know how. And so when you put a tablet in front of them with pictures to help them understand that this means that, they know how to push the button to tell you, I want an apple right now. But they don't know how to say it to you. And so as the technology continues to grow, we're able to provide more and more and more of that to kids and their families. And so we'll do things like if a family moves into our community, they end up in a place that doesn't have a fence, and they have a child with a severe developmental disability who's at risk of running out the door and into traffic. We will figure out how to hook them up with a provider who can build them a fence. We can't pay for all of it, but if they can figure out how to get folks to support them, we can pay for quite a bit of it, and we can help them make a better deal to get that fence made so that that child will stay safe. And so there's a lot of those things that we do for those families and those youth. And a lot of the time, the client is actually the child, but who we're working with is the family, the adults in the home. And then we're also the resource center for the community. So if you are in need of help, and you don't always know what it is you need when you call, you just know, I need something. I need a therapist, I need a psychiatrist, I need food, I need a place to live, I just need something. Our telephone number, the 764-8555, that is the Kenosha County, and this is paid for through Kenosha County, the Kenosha County Resource Center, Behavioral Health and Substance Abuse Resource Center. So we get calls every day about, we do an initial assessment and go through kind of a list of, what is it that brought you to call us today, and then we'll kind of go through what their needs are. And it might just be, let me hook you up with a therapist, it's going to be a few weeks, but you'll be okay. And it might be, you're in trouble right now, and so we're going to hook you up with a crisis counselor today. Why don't you just hang tight? We're going to send a crisis worker over to you.
So is this a crisis worker who you employ? Or
yes.
Okay.
So we do 24-hour mobile crisis intervention as well. And so if a resource center worker takes a call where there is a level of dangerousness, where that person really is suicidal, they'll kind of figure out how to get the person next to them to call crisis and perhaps the police. But we try to not intervene with the police as much as possible, to get to a place where that person we can then transfer that call over to our emergency mental health service so that a crisis case can be started so that we can figure out, can we manage this right now while they're in their home with natural supports? Or do we need to meet you at the emergency room to figure out, do you need to go to the hospital? Do you need your medication refilled? What are the needs that you need to have met right now to keep yourself safe?
So in addition to your own programs, it sounds like you provide a bridge or gap filler for those people.
Yes,
Yes.
that is correct.
So somebody calls, do they ever not get some kind of, I can take care of something for you, or it's just, I'm sorry, but you're not one of those we can help?
No,
No.
never. Now, there's not always available the absolute resource they need today. That happens. We have a number of homeless folks who call us every day, who are on the street today and don't have a place to go. We don't have a lot of emergency housing in Kenosha. We have the Shalom Center, which is lovely, but they are full quite a bit of the time. And we run a motel voucher program, so we can put somebody in a motel for a short period of time. It's a very small pot of money. And we do that so that then we can hook them up with all the other community services. But that doesn't mean we always have a resource for you. If you're calling us, telling us you're homeless today, and we can get you on the list for housing, we can get you on the list for the Shalom Center, we can try to help you figure out what are your resources in the community. Do you have an uncle? Do you have a cousin? Do you have a best friend that we can talk about? Maybe something happened and there's a rift. Maybe we can help mediate that to get you back there until some of these other things are available. So very rarely do we hang up the phone and we've done nothing. Even those folks who we have no place, do you have food? Let's figure out how to get you to the pantry. Let's figure out how to get the ID that you need to get you to the pantry, because you can't access because you don't have an ID. Well, we'll help you get that. What are the things that, do your children need diapers? Do your kids need food? Do you need formula? We have access to various programs that can get that for you. Okay, we can do that. And it might just be psychiatric, you need a psychiatrist. You need to get back on medication that was very helpful to you. So let's figure out how to do that. We do run a mental health clinic with a psychiatric APN piece, so we can do some immediate psychiatric intervention. Oftentimes that's not always available, but we do the best we can within a 48-hour period to get somebody involved. Or again, we can always get people to the emergency room. If that's the need, then that's what we do.
So does anyone ever feel like, well, you're just shifting me over here to somebody else? You're just directing me over to someone else. Why can't you just do it?
Unfortunately, absolutely. That is often people's experience. It is not the intent. But we are not the be-all, end-all of all things. We can't fix everything. I'd love to. I'd love to fix homelessness in Kenosha. It's just not possible. And so there are times that there is a person who calls every single day looking for this thing. And we've given them all the things we can, but we'll still sit and talk to them. Again, today's a new day. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's another set of problems we can help them with. So we'll take that call every single day. But yeah, there are people who are unsatisfied with the call by the time they're done. Absolutely.
So we talked a bit about seeing someone who was in the program young, and you see them later on. You see them maybe in another program. Do you consider these progressive steps, that these things don't just go from here to you're on your own, from here to these steps don't go all that quickly, that they are slow?
I think that's the basic developmental process of human beings.
Yes. Yeah, things don't happen overnight. And, a lot of times, when you have, as we saw, which is why we started the homeless youth program, and aftercare for kids aging out of care was, a lot of times we got kids when they were 17 years and 6 months old, and they had 2 high school credits. Yes. And they didn't have much family. Well, realistically, 18's no magic bullet for them. And so what you're trying to do is to figure out a way to help them over the years. And again, as Jeannine said earlier, the average age that somebody goes out on their own in this country and leaves their family is 26. And so the idea that these kids are going to be ready to go out at 18 is kind of ludicrous.
But even the idea of being in one program, and you feel like, all right, we're helping this person. Why did they have to go to another program? Why did they have to go yet to another program? Because it's a process, not a, okay, you're checked off of this, you're done. It's not a done thing. Is that what I get a sense of?
Well, it's interesting because the problem with some of the things you do is the people who are funding you say we work with people, for example, this age, and so when you're 21, this program is over. So a lot of times what we tried to do is to lengthen programs by using other sources of funding. The other thing is because we've had the luxury of having so many people work there for long periods of time, that a lot of the people that we worked with young we're working with when they're old. And so there's a lot of continuity in that. And some people realistically are always going to need some service, because that's kind of the human condition. Yeah. You know, none of us are out there on our own. And so if you don't have family and you don't have support, what we've endeavored to do is to try to build some support for you, even if it's just among us.
So since you deal with a number of people needing one type of assistance or another, are you able to say, okay, I've been here now, time for me to go home. Is it over until the next day?
Well, we have crisis 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
But for you?
No, for them.
I know that, but for you to go home and say, I can turn it off now, I'll go back tomorrow, it'll be a new day.
Yeah.
I think the way we were, certainly I can speak for myself, the way I was trained, I never took it very personally when the kids did wonderfully. Yeah. That was on them. And I never took it very personally when they weren't doing so good. That was also on them. You know, what I learned early on is I don't control anybody's life. And I'm there to provide as much assistance as I can, but if you take it all on yourself, you're not going to last very long in this work.
But your phone number's in the book.
Right. And the interesting thing about that was this, is they would want me to give them my number, and I wouldn't, because that's too easy. But if they had to look it up to call me, I would say I averaged a call every 3-6 months, because that extra step meant something, they really needed something where they thought I would be able to help. And if they called me, you know, sometimes that's the first thing I would always say is, well, what do you want to do? And a lot of times they would say, well, this is what I want to do. And I said, that sounds great. Good. Problem solved.
And you, Jeannine?
I think, I think it's the human condition. At what point do you stop calling your mom and ask, how do you do this? When you don't have that family background to make that call, if you've made these connections when you're young, that's where you call. This morning I called my dad to say, how do I do this? You know, I'm in my late 50s, for God's sakes. We all need people, and for a number of folks, we are it. Now, do I take that home? Sometimes. There are nights that I think about things, and it's like, what could I have done differently, or what? But it's much more about, for me nowadays, it's much more about running the business than it is about the people. Because what I know in running the business is that's what supports all the work. And if the business isn't doing well, then they can't do their work. And so that really has been more stressful for me than doing the actual social work.
So how many individual clients does the organization serve?
That is a really hard question because...
Well, I heard 100 here, 500 here, 600 crisis there.
Yeah, well, crisis, I can tell you the number of phone calls we get. So we get about 35,000 phone calls. Now that might be one person calling 100 times. We do have a number of people who call us twice a day, every day. But on average, about 35,000 phone calls. Then we do follow-up calls. So we, on average, do another 60 to 75,000 follow-up calls throughout the year. We bill so many hours of time. We have about 100 people in our community support program. We work with about 700 people in our resource center. We have 500 children in our long-term care programs. We pay rent for about 80 individuals or families in our homelessness programs. So a certain number is really hard to give you because it's a moving target.
Well, I think when there was an article in the newspaper mentioning 15,000 clients.
I would say that's about right. Over the course of a year, we touch about 15,000. That would be about right.
You also mentioned that you've developed programs. Programs have come, programs have gone.
Yep.
New things have come in their place.
Yep.
What's the future of Kenosha Human Development Services?
I think we're always looking for where the gaps are. I think there's a lot of energy being done right now in changing how crisis intervention is on the state level. And so we're trying to follow some of those trends. There's much more effort being put in the collaboration of like law enforcement and the hospital personnel and community providers in crisis intervention. And so there are some incentives right now to ensure that we're getting our partners involved, that we're not doing things in a vacuum. Personally, I think the idea that there just is not enough provision of service for the adults coming out of autism programs as children, there's just not enough support systems out there for those guys. I think that's a future area of development. Our clinic, our mental health, behavioral health clinic, I think that's something that we will continue to grow. I would love to merge that, and I know there's some partnership on the county level to wanting to merge our crisis intervention and our clinic so that there is what one might consider an urgent care available for mental health over the course of years.
Have state or national or maybe even local politics ever affected how you do what you do?
Always.
Yeah, policies change all the time. Direction that the community leaders decide this is the way we have to follow the money sometimes. And so absolutely, there was a time juvenile crisis and adult crisis were two different things. An adult crisis worker never worked with a child. At some point they decided, that's just not going to work anymore. So we need to do crisis from 0 to 100, and then we need to do child abuse and neglect. That was a really hard adjustment for the community. It was hard for us to wrap our brain around in the very beginning, but now, 3 years later, it makes a lot more sense that way. Because trying to do child abuse, neglect, and mental health for children and families was a really big job. And so it does make more sense, but that was not something we said, this was a great idea, let's do it. But that's the way the world went, and so that's why we had to go with it.
Well, does the world ever go to challenging whether or not a program you're doing should even be done anymore? I mean, in that political sense?
We haven't had a lot of that over the years. I think part of it is for better or ill, we just kind of did what we were doing.
Yeah.
And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it or asking permission, because that's not very helpful sometimes. But what we knew is we were very focused on the people that we worked with and trying to figure out how to meet their needs. Right. And so I always thought that made us very successful. Because the more you get involved in the political world, then it changes. Yeah. And so then you're on one side or the other. You don't want to be we're on the side of the people we're working with.
That's right.
And it doesn't matter whether the Republicans or the Democrats or somebody else is in charge. We're on the side of the people we're working with.
Okay, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for
You're
having
welcome.
us.